Yeah, I'm going to talk about my new book, Maurice Nicoll, Forgotten Teacher of the Fourth Way. And is he really forgotten? Well, I think most people, anyone interested in the Fourth Way, and again, what's the Fourth Way? Does anybody know what that is? Do we have to explain what that is? All that kind of stuff. So there's a little cascade of different ideas there that I have to go through. But he's forgotten in the sense that he's not really considered, I think, in the main kind of canon. But we'll get into this. But who was he? Well, Nicoll, I think is the way the Brits pronounce it. I've always said Maurice Nicoll. Here I've heard Maurice Nicoll, so Nicoll. Little more than a century ago, he was a leading Jungian psychologist here in Britain. And in a sense, he was to Jung as Jung had been to Freud. Freud had wanted Jung to carry the mantle of psychoanalysis for many reasons. One was that he was the only non-Jew in the circle, so he would have broken it out of the Viennese ghetto, as it were. But as we know, Jung had his own ideas, and the years when Nicoll knew Jung were the years when Jung was getting over or going through the breakup with Freud, when he was producing all the material that later we know of as in the Red Book. So it was an interesting thing, an interesting time for someone to have known Jung, especially someone who got as close to him as Nicoll did. He had a practice on Harley Street, so I guess I don't have to explain. If you get a practice on Harley Street, you're doing pretty well. His father was a well-known political thinker at the time, William Robertson Nicoll. Nobody knows about him now, but he was friends with the young Winston Churchill and Lord Asquith, and he wrote political leaders for lots of different newspapers and was the editors of several important literary journals. And he was an alpha male kind of character. They lived up in Frognall, not too far from where I live. I'm in West Hampstead. That's Hampstead proper. It's not too far. Apparently his father had like 30,000 books around all the time and smoked 20 packs of cigarettes a day and was constantly, on the equivalent of Twitter and, TikTok or whatever it would have been then, in touch with everybody. And Maurice was he was a bit withdrawn. He was a sensitive child. He was aesthetic, kind of arty, and kind of prone to science or kind of do-it-yourself kind of stuff. He was into gizmos and making things like that. And his father didn't have any time for those. He was a bit dominated by them. So in any case, he wound up becoming Jung's leading British exponent here. And he wrote the first book in English on Jung's psychology called Dream Psychology. And it's basically spelling out the differences between Freudian ideas about dreams and Jung's ideas. And this, again, this is pre the Red Book stuff, so there's no shadow, no anima, none of the stuff that we know is textbook kind of Jung now. It's real early stuff. But the fundamental difference is that for Freud, he's interested where dreams are coming from, and Jung is interested in where they're going to. For Freud, what made the dream happen? Once we find that, we get that splinter out of your psyche, and you'll be okay. And for Jung, it's like, what is that dream telling you want, you need, you must have? Where is it leading, and that kind of stuff. So those are the projective tendencies. In the early part of the book, Nicoll is smacking the whole kind of feud going on in the early years of psychoanalysis here in London. Ernest Jones is, who's Freud's first biographer, and he's sort of laying down the law, and he wants to make an echt Freudian, British analytical, psychoanalytical group here. We got to get rid of all the Jungians, and one of the Jungians he needed to get rid of. And in a certain sense, when destiny called in the shape of a white Russian refugee from the Bolshevik Revolution, in the form of one P.D. Uspensky, whose books are in this place, and he had written a book in Russia that was translated in English in the States called Tertium Organum. A fellow named Claude Bragdon translated it, who happened to know Russian, and it was a Russian refugee there who happened to have a copy with him. And Bragdon and Uspensky shared an interest in things like the fourth dimension and higher dimensions. They were kind of the chaos theory, or I don't know, whatever. It's not superstrings. What is it these days? That's the latest scientific hip thing. Whatever it was the thing that was very popular. Then it was like the fourth dimension and stuff like that. So in any case, they translated the book, and the book became a surprise bestseller in the States and in the UK. Meanwhile, Uspensky is languishing in a white Russian refugee camp in Constantinople, soon to be called Istanbul. He had found himself there. He was funneled across a collapsing Russia with Gurdjieff and his band of students. First, at the beginning of World War I, then the Bolshevik Revolution, then the Civil War. So by about 1920, they got, I said, funneled across a collapsing Russia. And if you know Uspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, which is his account of his years with Gurdjieff, if you ever read it against the sense of that's going on historically, sort of in the background. So it's kind of an adventure story. So, but in any case, Lady Rothermere, who was the wife of a newspaper baron here in England, she read Tertium Organum, and she was the equivalent of, mind, body, spirit, maven at the time. And she got in touch with A.R. O'Raj, who was the editor of a journal called The New Age. The New Age before we discovered the New Age sometime in the late 70s or 80s. People like Shaw and Wells and Chesterton and others were published in it. He had published some articles by Uspensky. And somehow, through fate, destiny, whatever, they found where he was. And she sent him a telegram saying, I must see you, money no object, London, New York. And with it was a handsome check for the royalties about the best-selling book that he had no idea about. So if Uspensky was in search of miraculous, I can say incontestably then it came to him. Right then, miraculous came to him in the white refugee camp in the form of, big hefty check and an invitation to go anywhere. So he said London. He came here in 1922, 22. Lady Rothermere has a studio digs in St. John's Wood, which at the time was a bit recherché. It was if you know the Dennis Wheatley novels from the 1920s and 30s, well, the bad stuff in London is happening in St. John's Wood for some reason. Now it's, you can't afford the cappuccinos, but in any case, she's entertaining Uspensky, and people like T.S. Eliot, Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, and A.E. Waite, and Algernon Blackwood, and others are going to these lectures. And Nicoll attends a lecture, not there, but he attends a lecture at Kensington Town Hall, put on by the Quest Society, which was G.R.S. Mead's breakaway group from the Theosophical Society. And he's electrified. He's so shaken by what he hears from Uspensky that he goes back home. He's living over by Regent's Park then. Rushes into the room. His wife, Catherine, has just had their child. And he ignores the child and shakes her and said, "You must come and see Uspensky. He's answered all of my..." Okay, I'll go. And she goes to lectures and becomes a devout student. Uspensky is not lecturing on the best-selling ideas of Tertium Organum. All that's behind him. He has learned a new lesson, and this was his experience with Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff had a very austere, stark message that everyone in this room, including me, especially me, because I think I know what I'm talking about right now, is absolutely asleep and mechanical and just blathering on like a machine in some way, or a computer, or AI, or whatever, I guess, Well, that would be the metaphor today, I'm not really conscious, I'm artificially conscious in some way, something like that. But there's a way of becoming truly conscious, and this was the very strict regimen that you can find in all the books, and it's called the Fourth Way, and this is a metaphor sort of that Uspensky develops in Search of the Miraculous, because traditionally there are three ways of somehow developing on yourself and developing a more intense sense of being and consciousness. And one is the physical way, the way of the fakir. He's the guy who lies on the bed of nails, or sits in the same position, for hours on end. Somebody who spends a lot of time at the gym or in yoga class today might classify for someone on that route. Then there's the way of the emotions, the way of the monk, the devotional, Hare Krishna, Bhakti Yoga. You devote yourself, body and soul to the deity or to the guru. Ramakrishna, the story was that whenever he just heard the name Kali, the Divine Mother, he would fall into a swoon of ecstasy. His emotions were so tuned to that. And then there's the way of the yogi, which is the mental way, dhyana, concentration. You meditate and you become a master of your mind. Now, all of those ways can take you pretty far, but the problem is they focus on one thing at the expense of the others. So if you're the fakir, your body's down, but your emotions and your mind are, you can't do a thing with them. If you're the devotional one, your emotions are finely tuned to the spiritual, but you can't, your body isn't that good, and you can't think your way out of a Ziploc bag. And if you're the intellectual, your mind is fantastically attuned, but your emotions, well, we all know intellectuals have no idea what to do with emotions, and they can't dance. All right? So it's a problem. So but Gurdjieff said there's a way you can do all of them at the same time. And this tripartite kind of system, it goes back to Plato. You can see it in Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment, if you know the, and the brothers Karamazov, if you know the three brothers. There's Mitya is the physical brother, Alyosha is the emotional, the monk, and Ivan is the intellectual and all that. So, I mean, it's you can find it in different places, but there it's kind of spelled out in a very particular sort of way. But the way Gurdjieff has designed, and this was the regimen that after attending some of Uspensky's lectures, then Gurdjieff came to town, and he made an appearance here in London, and everyone was so cowed by him that no one could ask a question. He just sat in silence for such a long time, and then finally someone asked him the question. I'm going off in different tangents at the same time, but the one question they asked was, what would it be like to see things through essence? And this is a central opposition or kind of polarity in the Gurdjieff teaching, is the personality in essence. So personality, we're all here, our personality, we're all very charming, and we all hope everybody gives us likes and all that sort of thing. We're all very charming. But our essence is something that's deep, deep, deep inside us. Maurice Nicoll's essence was there when he was a young boy, and his father, alpha male, was like shouting around him in Winston Churchill. So he had to develop a personality in order to protect his inner self. And think about that. We all need to do that, but over time the personality becomes a shell, and we can't escape it. And characters like, I was going to say that tripartite system turns up in Colin Wilson's work, and his work has influenced me a great deal. He writes about T.E. Lawrence as the physical, and Van Gogh is the, T.E. Lawrence is the intellectual, Van Gogh is the emotional, and Nijinsky is the physical. Thing is that the personality and these outsider types, they're all people that they yearn to break out of their personality in some way. They feel suffocated by it in some way, and will do anything to break out of it. And it sometimes leads to rather, dangerous sort of methods. Live dangerously, Nietzsche said. Build your houses on Vesuvius. So in any case, so we're back to, so all three, and so Nicoll winds up at Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, which is it. Sorry.
Gurdjieff was asked a question.
Oh, the question was, sorry, very good, thank you. The question was, what would it be like to see things in essence? And he said, everything more vivid. So things certainly got vivid after that for everybody in that room, because he announced, I've opened up this institute. And all of Uspensky's students just crossed the channel. They didn't have the Eurostar, but they got on the ferry and they went over. And Nicoll was one of those. And in order to do this, he sold his practice on Harley Street, gave it up. He borrowed against the inheritance from his father, which was considerable. And he took himself, his wife, their infant child, the nanny, and on the way in Paris, they picked up 2 goats at the Parisian zoo because the baby, for some reason, needed goat milk. And Nicoll had the nous to think once he passed through the gates, it might be difficult for me to find 2 goats. So there's, even at the beginning, there's like the surreal, strange kind of live action Zen koan character to once you got involved with Gurdjieff, because suddenly you don't know what's happening anymore. He was a master of creating artificial inconvenience, artificial crisis, artificial situations in which reality, although you look around, it doesn't look any different, but suddenly it is very, very different. And even before then, the idea of Nicoll negotiating with a Parisian zookeeper to buy 2 goats, to get on the train to get to Font, that just strikes me as like something that's shadowing what's going to happen. So he goes there early November 1922, and what it was, the Château, I'm trying to remember, there's like a long history. At one point it belonged to the lawyer who defended Dreyfus. And I actually went there. I went there in 1983 with a friend of mine. We went on a mini search to the miraculous. And among the different places we went to was the Château in Fontainebleau. It's still there, and there's a plaque outside for the forest philosophers And they mentioned Catherine Mansfield, who's the New Zealand writer who died there, not because of the regimen, because she had tuberculosis in the first place, and she had hoped that Gurdjieff might be able to stop it or at least slow it down. But there's like a plaque to Catherine Mansfield because he was in the newspaper at the time, and they were called the forest philosophers. And in the Daily Mail, the equivalent here was having articles about the people in the forest and all that kind of thing. But it was a rundown chateau, and the way Gurdjieff was able to incorporate these three different traditional ways was that it was physical labor, putting the thing together, mowing the lawns, chopping the hedges, digging a moat, and just any kinds. And then the emotional thing was that he was a master of putting people together who would not get on with each other. They would very quickly, the fur would fly, the friction, the sparks would, flare, and it just was impossible. You had to control your negative emotions. You weren't supposed to express negative emotions. That was one of the mental. That was the next one over. That was a series of different exercises, mental, psychological exercises, not expressing negative emotions. Remembering yourself was the main one. Self-remembering. According to Gurdjieff and the way Uspensky describes it very clearly in Search for Miraculous, is that most of the time we don't remember that we actually exist. We would say we look at it as if it's a movie, or somehow even though we're in reality, we're in a virtual reality kind of thing most of the time. And it's only rare moments under crisis, or if you would find yourself in a strange place. And this is what sold it for me when I first read Search for Miraculous, this sense of like, what, me here? You're in somewhere you never were before, and like it's all new, and then you realize that you being there at the same time somehow. So it's like a double exposure. In any case, I thought, yeah, I know what that's like. And in a way, it's not too different from what the Gurdjieff's contemporary, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, he said, we all suffer from Seinvergessenheit, which is forgetfulness of being. Actually, since Plato, we've suffered from forgetfulness of being. So that's a whole other thing. And both of them, too, strangely enough, there's some things in common. They both wrote unreadable books. Okay, Being in Time is a little more readable than Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, I would say. But tough choice which one to take with you to the desert island. But they both said that a surefire method of becoming conscious of being is to have a vivid grasp of the reality of your death. Vividly grasp the fact that you are going to die. Other people die. We all know that other people die. But that it's going to happen to you. And suddenly everything, and this ties into a line Colin Wilson quotes all the time from Dr. Johnson, when he said, when a man knows he's going to be hung in a fortnight, it concentrates the mind wonderfully. So there's a crisis, threat, somehow wakes us up. And Gurdjieff was a master at creating crisis. So in the artificial conditions behind the closed doors of the Institute, where lots of people were coming in, different people, not celebrities, but sort of literary people, different people turning up and all that. They're there for a little while. Some people were there for a longer stay. Nicoll was there for about, not quite a year, but maybe like 8 months, 6-8 months, something like that. It was like, Alice in Wonderland is sort of like the cheap, analogy, metaphor. There's all these weird stories. It's like, it was unclear whether there actually was an institute or not. J.G. Bennett, who had spent time there, and then later near Gurdjieff in his last days when he was holding court in the tiny, tiny flat in the Rue du Colonel Reynard near the Étoile in Paris, where among the other crises and inconvenience he would create, with a room probably half the size of this one, he would jam in about 50 people around a dinner table, and he would serve this incredible sumptuous kind of thing, after which you had to knock back about a half a dozen shots of very high-octane vodka. So that Bennett spent time with Gurdjieff then, but then when he was at the Institute, Gurdjieff was telling him all this stuff about, yes, I intend to build an observatory there, and I've invented a way to make the planets look larger, and and all this kind of stuff. Meanwhile, he's telling Nicoll, all this is temporary. Soon, none of this will be here. Everyone will be somewhere else. We do not build for posterity. And there's a wonderful story about Mrs. Beaumont, who was Bennett's partner. She was an older woman, but she wasn't in the work. That's the homely term for the Fourth Way. because it is work. But she would visit occasionally the prairie. And one time she was there, and the hygiene was absolutely non-existent. It was filthy. It was just disgusting. One of the things that Nicoll had to do as kitchen boy was, along with getting up around at dawn and lighting all the ovens to cook for about 50 or 60 people, he had to wash all the dishes, but in cold water and with no soap. And apparently this is something that he carried on later in life at the different sort of off-the-grid communities that he started. And the ladies around him would let him do the dishes, and then they would make sure he wasn't around, and then they'd wash them with soap to make sure they were clean. So that's one of the stories. You've got to find it in the book. This is just a general background. But after that, then he had to do that, and then he had to wash all the dishes and all this kind of thing. And it was this strange situation. Oh yeah, Mrs. Beaumont shows up, and the hygiene is horrible. And there's all these flies in the kitchen. And she says, "Why don't you put up fly paper?" And like, whoa, should we put up fly paper? Do we put up with flies? Is this a test? Is it not a test? And she basically went like this and put up some fly paper. And then Gurdjieff came in and sort of went, "Oh, magnificent! What a masterstroke!" And so you didn't know you're suddenly in some place where, I mean, there's a whole technique, it's a whole teaching, but I mean, this kind of, talk about the uncertainty principle. It was kind of like what was the sort of character of the whole place at the time. You didn't know whether anything was really there or not. And then when A.R. Orage turned up, was a portly man of 50 who smoked, a pack a day, the editor of the New Age, and could hold his own with H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw and others, of the day. He was given a shovel, forbidden to smoke, and told to dig. And he dug a hole, a pretty deep hole. And then they said, "Okay, fill the hole in." And then he did the next day the same thing. And then the next day the same thing. The next day the same thing. So he's crying himself to sleep in this tiny little cell, actually, that he's living in. And the nicotine withdrawals aren't helping, right? And he's thinking, what have I got myself into here? And then the next day he goes and starts digging, and suddenly he's enjoying it. He's digging like he's never dug before, as they used to say in the 60s. And he's digging and digging, digging, and it's like suddenly he has this whole new tank of gas or petrol. And a similar thing happened to Bennett, where he had something like that as well. And as Nicoll described it in these diaries, that I go into some detail in the book, but I can't go into them here because we only have a short time. And then they're a whole thing in themselves. So that's another reason why you have to buy the book. He says Gurdjieff's method is one of frustration. And one of the things I think, and in a homely, say, a way we could all understand, and not saying that Gurdjieff didn't learn this in the ways that he said about, meeting the Sarmong Brotherhood in Central Asia, much like Emanuel Swedenborg-inspired met, the masters in Tibet. But I think he figured out a way of inducing the second wind. And if in athletes, if you're running and running and running, like, if I can't do it anymore, I'll just try one more, and then bang, as an extra tank of petrol kicks in. And William James, the great American psychologist, had written about this in a wonderful essay called The Energies of Men in the early 19th century. And he basically says, we all live subject to degrees of fatigue which we have come only through habit to obey. We think that's all we can do. And he talks about what he calls these neurasthenic patients. Oh, I can't possibly. No. You can't ask me that. No. Get up, or whatever. Tie your shoes, or just no. I can't make the simplest effort would be too much, and you can't get away with it now. But there was something they called the bullying treatment, where the doctor would force them to do something. And James said first was the extremity of distress, and then was the sudden awakening to, my God, child's play. Where's Everest? So it was a way of breaking through the artificial limits. It doesn't work for everybody. Some people come away from it, damaged. This is something that has happened. But it is a way that, abandon all hope, O ye who enter here. Once you realize that you've decided that's what you're going to subject yourself to. So people were, consciously doing this. And there's different. Others as well. There's different sorts of ways in which you can confront something that you feel is the impossible. One of the reasons why Gurdjieff's method worked when it did in this context was that most of the people coming to him were upper class intellectuals who never pushed a broom, put it that way. So forcing them to. One of the great insights of J.G. Bennett when he was made kitchen boy was that there was a puddle on the kitchen floor. And he had no idea what to do with it. And someone said, it threw a rag down on the, mop it up. Oh my God. So this is someone he was in British intelligence, so let's not go there, right? Guy in British intelligence didn't know what to do with the puddle on the floor, and so it was a revelation that you could get a rag and do that. So there were a lot of people that from that background, and so Gurdjieff was putting them in situations where it was completely new to them. And it could be brutal, so if someone who was very, very sensitive, didn't like blood, then you had to slaughter the chicken. If there's the door, if you want to stay, you have to slaughter the chicken. Or something along those lines. If people were there that slaughtered chickens already, or knew how to sweep a broom or whatever, it wouldn't have had the same effect. But in that context, that was most of the I have to say, Uspensky didn't go there. Uspensky went on visits, but he played his own cards. He kept quiet during the 1920s mostly. After the months that Nicoll was there, he came back to London, started his practice again, and he started attending lectures by Uspensky. Uspensky was having them over in Baron's Court. Then much later on, there was Cullet House, which is still there now, but in Baron's Court. And in about 1931, Uspensky told Nicoll to go out and start teach on his own. And they became friends, which was actually quite remarkable, because Uspensky was not an easy guy to be friends with. He was very, very. He took the whole idea of being conscious all the time, very, very extreme. So it was very much, no small talk and nothing like that. Except late in the evening when he got through a couple bottles of Chardonnay, and he would reminisce about old Russia, before he met Gurdjieff, and when he was hanging out with poets and artists in St. Petersburg and Moscow and places like that. I think over that way, Baron's Court, he starts, later on up in Golders Green, again in this neck of the woods where I live now, up on Finchley Road. If you're ever in the Hampstead Parish Churchyard, which is I think it's Church Row. It's behind the Hampstead Village where the tube stop is. So, sort of, you can find it, Google it. But in that churchyard, there's a wonderful gravestone for Orage, and it's an enneagram. I don't know if you know the Gurdjieff, the 9-pointed star on it. It's carved by Eric Gill. Don't tell anybody, because people don't like Eric Gill these days. Someone might go and deface it. I hope no one in the room holds a grudge. But it's a wonderful thing. And then below it is a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita. There's other reasons to go there. Evelyn Underhill, the writer of Mysticism. She's really under the hill there. Sorry, it's a bad joke. But she's buried there as well. And actors and others as well. So, how was it? He starts having classes there. But then, like practically everybody else who gets involved with Gurdjieff, they all get what I call institute-itis. They want to start their own institute. Uspensky had one out in Virginia Water, a place called Line Place. I was out there. It's a huge, mansion, grounds and all that. He's buried out there. And Nicoll starts wanting to do that. And he gets a variety, over years, different places out, and I guess it's the home counties. So out, 40 miles outside of London or something like that, a variety of different ones. And he more or less, he keeps his practice up going until the outbreak of World War II. And then he stops because he spends all the time where they are, out in the place that they've gone. I'm trying to remember the name of that one. That's not Great Amla. Oh, Taipans, that's what it is. A place called Taipans, which is the name they gave to the place. It was the name of the field, wherever it was. It was a pond there, whatever. And it looked like very unpromising land to build on. And Nicoll said, yes, perfect. So he inherited the whole idea of, proceed with as many difficulties as possible. And the whole idea is to overcome the difficulties. Again, we're not building for posterity. And they didn't, because what they built there, they inherited a house and they actually built one. And there's these really, there's a couple funny, well, I hope they're funny. I think they're funny. In the book where Nicoll has to, he has to sort of ply the building inspector with some sherry before he goes his rounds, and it's kind of Gurdjieffian sort of mood, because not everything is ready. And it's sort of half ready, so if he touches the right places, that's fine. But if he goes through something else, and his whole idea that he might put his foot through a plasterboard, where there should have been a floor or something like that. And so this whole idea of him wheeling around, I always get, there's a kind of fun sense around Nicoll, because he's a jovial character. He wouldn't be out of place in an episode of Poirot, I always think, because he dresses like that too, in that 30s, like very clean white, sort of, with the trilby and all that. But it's all very, there's this kind of fun sense, and he said, serious things have to be, spoken about in humorous ways and things of that sort. And one of his great readers is John Cleese, from Monty Python. If you go online, if you're interested, he names Nicoll one or two places where it's like his top 10 books. So Nicoll's Psychological Commentaries. So I'm drifting around, so he starts and that place they built in Taipans, and there's the structure they have, and then they built a whole addition to it, which is something that Nicoll had done when he was at Fontainebleau with Gurdjieff, where they built something called the study house, which was where Gurdjieff started to teach the famous Gurdjieff movements, the dances. And it had this sort of, like, Arabian Nights kind of decor and all that sort of thing. So Nicoll very much wanted to recreate the conditions that he was under when he was at Fontainebleau, and so he built this place, Taipans. But when the war broke out and the Blitz started, it was requisitioned by the army. And it was mothers and children, and in various other places. So I'm going to just go to cut to the short, because maybe you have some questions. I think I'm supposed to just talk for 30 minutes, but I think I went sort of beyond that. He dies in 1953, and the last place they have is a place called Great Amwell House. And by this time, he's got about 600-700 sort of people coming out on these work weekends. Most of the last years of his life, he lived in a little commune, as it were, off-the-grid community. There was about 13 people, 14 people, most of them women around him. He was married, but he had, gurus often do. They had a lot of women around them. And they were like the nucleus, and then people would come out on the weekends. And one of the things the diaries show is that he was working for the longest time on this little book that was finally published called The New Man. And we can say Nicoll's unique contribution, but say to the work, along with the fact that was pointed out that if you're aware of Jung's work and Swedenborg's ideas, and you read the commentaries, you can see where he's bringing them in. But he's not name checking them, but he's the shadow and things like that. Or love and wisdom, this kind of Swedenborgian themes come in there. But the New Man is his esoteric interpretation of some of the parables in the Gospels. And if you know Swedenborg did that as well, but he created this doorstopper, Aurora Coleesta, which thankfully that's only Genesis and the Book of Revelations. So thankfully he stopped there. I think he thought he made his point. But the New Man's about like that. And actually, it had to be pulled away from Nicoll. The publisher, who became one of his students, basically asked, "Can I see what you have written on it?" And Nicoll gave it to me. He said, "Oh, this is perfect as it is." Because one reason or another, Nicoll he found it difficult later in life to finish writing projects. Although one of the strange things about him is that before he met Jung, before he met Gurdjieff, he was writing best-selling books under a pseudonym Martin Swain, and he wrote stories for the Strand. At the same time, Conan Doyle was writing stories for the Strand and things like that. He wrote a book called Lord Richard in the Pantry, which at the time became a bestseller. It was in the West End as a theater piece. It became a film. It's on the BFI's list of the great lost films. And I may explain the obscure by the even more obscure by saying that it's the equivalent to me in American culture. There's a 1930s screwball comedy called My Man Godfrey with William Powell and I believe it's Carol Lombard or Carol Lombard. And the joke there is that it's an aristocrat who pretends to be the butler. So it's upstairs pretending to be downstairs. And so that's any case. So difficult to finish these writing projects. And the psychological commentaries are basically these sermons he gave on Fridays to his groups. And that starts up in the early 1940s. And they're collected, and they're first published, Watkins puts out an edition of them later on. They're first published privately, and then it's kind of a general, publication. And they more or less came out shortly before Nicoll passed away. He dies. 1948, he told his groups that he didn't have much longer to live. He had five more years to live, but he somehow had an intuition that he wasn't going to be around that much longer. And I think that was one of an impetus to finally get something published. And he left unfinished another book about sort of the esoteric interpretation of the parables called The Mark. And the Mark is Nicoll grew up a Presbyterian, a Scot. He came from Scotland. It's a very dour religion. And I can only give you a little hint of this, but early on, he had this feeling that he did not belong to the congregation. And one of the congregations he didn't belong to was St. Andrew's Reformed Church on Finchley Road and West End Lane in my neighborhood. He didn't belong to that one because he felt he had what he called unclean thoughts. Unclean thoughts. And they were mostly about sex. And one of the things that surprised me, and as far as I know, surprised everybody else who's read the book, is one of the things the diaries reveal is that he was obsessed with sex. And I will only leave you with this saying it was an obsession he pursued with one hand. If you know the old French definition of pornography, which is literature one reads with one hand. But along with that, it showed that he was his early years growing up with this alpha male father and also under the Scot Presbyterian, very dour religion, just imbued him with the sense of inferiority and sin. And one of the things that he sort of changed, let's say, or transformed was the notion of sin became missing the mark. You aimed for something, but you didn't quite get there. That was the sin. Not whatever, that you had unclean thoughts of this or that or whatever it might be, but you missed the mark. And what you were aiming for was, he took the Greek word metanoia, which translates, it's a change of mind, but we'd say, oh, I changed my mind. It's very bland. No, you didn't change your mind. You just, change your mind is not the same way as changing your trousers. You know what I mean? It's like, it's the same mind, but it's like, we say change your mind in English. It doesn't mean the same thing as the Greek metanoia. It was like a revelation, a moment of what the ancient Gnostics aptly called gnosis, kind of sudden vision of things. So this was sorts of the ideas that he tried to relate to the parables. And it's in this take it or leave it kind of style. He doesn't really explain. He says this is the story, this is the meaning, but he doesn't say, there's no sources or anything like that. So it is kind of, you just sort of have to take it and leave it and meditate on it. And, it all depends. So one of the things that I came away with after reading all this again, and I read him years ago and I had to reread a lot of stuff, is there's a great similarity between how he understands the parables and how he understands dreams. In a certain way, you could say dreams are parables written by the unconscious mind. There's a meaning, but it's conveyed in the symbolic form. That it's not literal and logical. His father was he was a believer in the literal meaning of the Bible and all that. So, water into wine, Jesus came, bang, and it was Cabernet Sauvignon. He literally changed it into wine. But for Nicoll, no, it's a metaphor. It's a symbolic change. It's a change in being. And you say all the parallels are about that. They're about this. This is the esoteric message, basically, of what he would call a change in being. And we can get back to Martin Heidegger, or Sein Vergessenheit, forgetfulness of being. And simple way to look at it is most of the time we're on this horizontal kind of plane, one thing after the other, just dealing with everything. I mean, you have some vague sense that in the future everything will get better, or this is all going to work out to something, this is all going to end up in something in the future, it's heading towards something. Nicoll says, no, it's not. But there's a vertical line that takes you out of time, out of what he called tick-tock time. And one of his great readers was J.B. Priestley. So he's not a name to conjure with anymore, but in the 20th century he was a best-selling author. He had a hat trick. He had 3 plays on the West End at the same time. But he was fascinated with the mystery of time. He called himself a time-haunted man. And he wrote about Nicoll's ideas of time in this book called Man in Time. And he also, I'll just say, he wrote a novel called The Magicians. And it's a vaguely sort of disguised account in some ways of Fourth Way ideas as a character, and it's rather like Gurdjieff. But he talks about tick-tock time. And then there's time alive. So tick-tock time is that time, and I think we're running out of it. Time alive is that time when suddenly you burst through the everyday and you touch the eternal. So thank you very much.
We still have time for a few questions.
Oh, good, see?
Awesome.
I always say, does anybody have any answers? That's
I've read plenty of psychological commentaries, but I've never come across any reference to sex.
No, no. The whole, this is why I say it's a surprise. All of the, I can't go into it really in detail. Or I could, but I mean, it's a whole other thing. But all of the it's all in the diaries. There's no evidence in any way whatsoever. There's a fellow named John, what's his name? I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now. It's in the book. He's a researcher up in Edinburgh. He unearthed a stack of diaries in 2017. They were in possession of the daughter of a fellow named Sam Copley, who was one of Nicoll's students. He wrote a book about Nicoll, say, Maurice Nicoll, Portrait of a Vertical Man. The other book about him is by his secretary named Beryl Pogson, and that's called Maurice Nicoll, A Portrait. So the 2 earlier books are portraits, and I'm a bit more warts and all. John Wilmot, that's his name, he transcribed these diaries, and it turned out to be 1,000+ pages of material. And he and another researcher, a guy named Jeffrey Adams in the States, who actually was the one who got me interested in writing the book. He got in touch with me and said, would you be interested in writing a book about Maurice Nicoll? I said, he's kind of a niche character, blah, 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 but I said he's interesting. Not too many people have Jung, Gurdjieff, Uspensky as teachers, and that kind of thing. So in any case, that's why I wound up doing it. And so he sent me this transcript of these diaries. And it's all very fragmentary. It's not straightforward. It's a dream diary, and then he's trying to interpret the dreams at the same time, and he writes in a code. So it's really, it's difficult, terrain. And it was a real slog reading them, I have to tell you. And they're convinced that these diaries are as important as, say, Jung's Red Book, at least in the sense of if you want to understand Nicoll. And I said that's true. But they're not as accessible to the average reader as, say, the Red Book is. But one of the things that comes through in the diaries is that he just has an obsession with sex. But he had, whether it's true his upbringing or whatever, he somehow comes through as an inhibition about actualizing that obsession in the outer world, put it that way. He prefers imaginative sex. But one of the things is that it becomes a kind of devotional practice to a kind of eternal feminine figure, a goddess kind of figure, that he has these dialogues with. And I wonder if, as I mentioned earlier, that he was with Jung during the time Jung was going through, the breakup with Freud, and Jung was practicing what he later called active imagination. I wonder if he talked to Nicoll about this, because it seems in some ways he's using, enjoyment to induce sort of very deep trance kinds of states, and then he communes with this kind of, eternal feminine figure. But there's the unclean thoughts are there too. And he's an early victim of the whore Madonna kind of thing, which nowadays we just, there's jokes about it or whatever, but at the time was still, was not part of the common currency kind of thing. So even as a young boy, he said, his kind of spiritualized idealization of women were participated inextricably with also these kinds of, what he called unclean thoughts. He doesn't go into detail. It's not a particular fetish, but we can imagine, the repertoire is only so limited, so whatever. But it's kind of a humiliation at the same time as a kind of, idealization. And at the same time, he says that his religious aspirations, that's just because he had a deep love of Christ, he really wanted to find a congregation that he could belong to. And in the end, he found a congregation not only that he belonged to, it was one that he was leading, and he was giving the sermons all the time. So in a way, he was like his father, but in different. Which, strangely enough, is rather the same way like Crowley, because Crowley's father was a preacher, and then Crowley preached, Philema. Crowley was obsessed with sex, but much more extrovertedly than Maurice. Maurice pursued his muse in the closet. And again, biographer has to ask these questions. Who knew? He's living in these communities with 12, 13 sort of people around him all the time. And here is another thing. This is one of these things that biographers love and hate at the same time. He does marry someone. It's a woman who comes to him as a patient first, a client. And she has a horror of physical sex. Right? So they're made for each other. He's obsessed with a kind of imaginary sexual activity. They have a child. But it's sort of, they become, there's, again, in the 1,000, sorry I'm talking like this, but in the 1,000 pages of this diary, there's never once great sex with the wife last night, or anything like that, and there's very rarely any kind of dreams about that. There's always about other people, and very, very, strange sorts of stuff. So that's the salacious stuff. If that doesn't get you to buy the book, folks, I don't know what else will. So they get married, but they're kind of soulmates more than anything else. They're sort of spiritual soulmates. And she becomes the teacher of the work herself, too, over the years. But but at the same time, he never overcomes that sense of shame that was indoctrinated into him in his childhood. And it's never, he never knows whether after a session, he'll come away feeling ecstatic, which he does. He achieves these exalted sorts of states sometimes, and it seems like he's communing with the infinite la-di-da. But then it could be like a shame-ridden hangover, and he feels horrible, afterwards. But he's just like the rest of us. I mean, if nothing else, it shows these people. I'm not taking away from his value as a teacher, and I even said when the person asked me to do the book, and I started reading the diaries, I said, do you really want this? Because it's tough enough, having a good reputation being an esoteric teacher in the first place. And then, there's another one who's just obsessed with sex, but as far as I know, it never left the closet. None of his students were ever involved in anything like this. It never came out in any. And in the diaries you show, it's something that he keeps very close to his chest. There's all these times he's saying he just wants to get away from it all and get a room in Camden Town. Camden Town was considered a insalubrious part, it still is, but insalubrious part of the town back then. But he wanted to get away and just get a little room to himself and all this kind of thing. So you even have a sense where, he's facing the same kinds of conflicts, us normal human beings face as well. So, yeah. Did that answer about 5 questions, I hope?
Yeah, but I don't know why it's not in his teachings in
Because
psychological
it had nothing to
commentaries.
do with that. It was somebody who's private. There was nothing to do. And in fact...
But the work is all about work on oneself.
Oh, well,
So
no, that's a different question. Did he work on himself about that? Well, I raised that. I said, one can't help but ask, if you are going through this savage kind of self-division with yourself, who else would you go through self-division with? Are you still in the right position to be able to teach the kind of thing you're teaching. So, but this sadly happened to, Uspensky spent probably at least 5 or 6 years of his life he thought it was no longer the work, it was a job. And he basically drank himself to death because he felt that he had made a mistake. He had given up his own way, his own path, given up his own creativity, and he would stay up late at night, especially when he moved to avoid the Blitz. He went to New York. And I went to the farm, this place called Franklin Farms in Mendham, New Jersey, outside of New York, and I went there in the 19th, because I was involved in the work in the 80s, for a few years in New York and in LA, and along with going to the side of the prairie and finding where Gurdjieff's flat was in Paris, we went to this place in Mendham. But when he was there, he just kind of became a recluse. Madame Uspensky was really running the show, and she was a real Harridan. She was an alpha female. I don't know, what's the equivalent do you call would you say an
I
alpha?
don't understand that anyway.
An alpha? In any case, so, don't go that way, whatever. But just historically, the fact this is something that happened. And in those last days, Uspensky came back to London, 1947. Interestingly enough, Gurdjieff had once told Uspensky the Earth was in a very bad place in the universe. That's why everything is difficult. The very bad place in the universe that Uspensky went to in 1947 was London after the war. It was probably aside from Russia maybe, or actually Germany somewhere was bombed out. It was probably one of the worst places to be in. It was rationing. It was bombed out, and it was absolutely cold winter. So again, it's just these strange, sort of things that happen. But he came back. He was dying, and he held a series of lectures, again over in Barron's Court, a place called Colored House, which is still there now. This is the home of the Studies Society, which was a group that grew out of Uspensky's groups from here in the 20s and 30s and 40s. But in these series of lectures, he rejected the work of the system. He refused to answer any question. What system? What work? What are you talking about? Who told you you were asleep? And why did you listen to him? Things like that. So it was a searingly honest admission that he had made a big mistake. And the story is that in his last days, he went back to this place, Line Place in Virginia Water, and one of his staunch followers, a guy named Rodney Collin, who later wrote a series of books and had his own groups in Mexico, actually, and in South America. He died mysteriously, too. But the story is that either Uspensky asked this or Collin thought it was a good idea to drive him around to all the places that he knew in England. And the reason to do this was that Uspensky's pet idea, before he ever met Gurdjieff, was what he called eternal recurrence. It's the idea that you have already been here to this lecture, I've already given it, and you've already gone home nth number of times, and we will do it again nth number of times. So think of it as reincarnation exactly into the same life. Or think of it as the film Groundhog Day.
I just say.
It's not just that day, it's your whole life. So when you die, you're born again. How it works out that other people are still alive when you die, we keep working out with six-dimensional time and all this sort of thing. But that was his pet idea. And Uspensky believed that if you could impress upon yourself memories of places you had been, next time around, you could remember. And he believed that déjà vu, the experience of déjà vu, was a sudden memory of a past life. I suspect it more likely it's a precognitive dream, where you dream the future. So I've written a book about that. It's called Dreaming Ahead of Time. I've 40 years plus of dream journals, where I have dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of precognitive dreams. They're not about winning the Derby, and they're not about disasters. They're about absolutely trivial, everyday, mundane things. And you think, why the hell did I dream that? The only thing interesting about them is that they're precognitive. But I think Uspensky, because even though it's interesting, he wrote a lot about dreams. He has a wonderful chapter. It's a book called New Model of the Universe, which is still readable. It's a study of dreams and hypnotism. And he explored hypnagogia, the in-between state, and he was one of the first lucid dream explorers, writing about waking up in a dream. But Freud, Jung, all that's just rubbish. He didn't think there was anything meaningful about the dreams and stuff like that. So I don't know why he didn't pick up on the precognitive dreams. Mostly because he was obsessed with this idea of eternal recurrence. But if you could remember, and next time around, you could change things somehow. And I believe that one of the things he wanted to change was his meeting with Gurdjieff. Or maybe something that happened subsequent to the meeting or something like that. Because he was.
Do you mean he wouldn't want that meeting, or?
Well, because he said, when someone said, Mr. Uspensky, why are you saying all these things now? I followed system doesn't work.
Wow.
So you broke in English, but there was sort of like that, and he gave up a lot once he became Gurdjieff's student, and then he followed his own way. But he kind of lost. I don't know. He sort of lost. I think one of the things was he gave up writing. And he thought of Tertium Organum, the book that basically freed him from a white Russian refugee camp. He said, "Oh, this was a sort of something from my youth," and I think he was he's on the dust jackets. He's always portrays a mathematician. He wasn't a mathematician. He was a journalist. He was a poet. He wrote poetry. He wrote these wonderful sort of prose poems of the Sphinx, and an early book, The Symbolism of the Tarot. I mean, it might not be anything really about the tarot, but these wonderful kind of fin de siècle kind of aesthetic prose poems about the tarot and all this kind of thing. And I said, he used to hang out. There's a place called the Stray Dog Cafe in St. Petersburg, where all the sort of modernist poets were hanging out. Anna Akhmatova and Mayakovsky and people like that. And he was hanging out there too. And he loved all that sort of stuff. But somehow, I think when he met Gurdjieff was this. I don't know if you know Zorba the Greek, the Kazansaki's story. If you know the movie, it's Anthony Quinn and what's his name? I can't think of his name right now. But the Zorba's this man's man, and this kind of namby-pamby weekly poet goes to live there. I'm going to show you how to live, and so it's sort of like that. So Gurdjieff is sort of like poetry. This is all rubbish. You're asleep right now. You're asleep. Good thing you met me, kind of thing. And but at the same time, Uspensky sort of held his own. But I think he gave up his own creative path, and at some point he was too old to sort of start again. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This is a personal question.
Last question.
Last question. Okay. Better be you. Are you in the work yourself, and what do you think it's effective, or do you?
I'm not in it. I'm in no way representative of it. Like I said, I was involved in it from 1981 to about 85 in New York City and in Los Angeles. I got a lot out of it at the time, but I was very young and interested in lots of other things. And I've recently written a memoir of how I went, because I used to be in a rock band. So I recently written a memoir, or signed the contracts for how I went from playing the rock band to writing the stuff I do. And part of it is about the time I spent with that. No, I got a lot out of it, and I think if it attracts you, go for it. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. Investigate, see what things are like, but there's a history, there's all different things, all different people, and there's a lot of bogus groups. I mean, the real group is the Gurdjieff Foundation that started in the early 1950s.
That's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, that's the only legit one. Gurdjieff Foundation starts in the 1950s. That's when I was involved in. It's still going. It's not quite as popular as it was, say, in the 70s and the 80s. It was really quite popular. It even got into sort of pop culture a bit. There's a John Cassavetes film, where I forget what it's called, but they're doing that. I forget, but there's one scene where someone, some like, I guess she's supposed to be a dumb, sexy blonde, says, "Yeah, I'm into Gurdjieff," or something like that in the film. So there was and there was the film of Meetings with Remarkable Men, which I think it's a rather dull film, except when Terence Stamp is on the scene. But then, what I have to say, there's a remarkable series of scenes in there where there's the performance of the Gurdjieff movements, which are just, they're very strange. They're not particularly pretty or beautiful or ballet, but they're very strange, very odd, rigorous movements. And I practiced them when I was involved in it years ago. And I have to say, I was saying before how, Gurdjieff knew how to induce second wind, and that was the way to do it. Because I did have the experience where I was trying to do these things, and there's a whole, it's very different, if you know this kind of thing, it's like 20 times that. Your hand's doing this, your foot's doing that, your head's doing all this kind of thing. The whole idea was to keep your conscious mind alert to the different movements, to follow the music, don't get frustrated with your emotions, and the body doing that. And it's incredibly frustrating, and really difficult. There was something like that, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I'm not going to do this. Okay, one more time, I did it. Bang! I did it. And I had the Orage experience. And the way I said it, I just wanted to hop my car to drive to San Francisco and back, just for fun. It just felt, ooh, so he was able to induce. So it works, So, and that's why I feel like there's something there. But again, it's not for everybody, but not everything is.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Gary.